Hello, welcome back to Diagonal Move. My name's Neil and we are about to enter the January-February turn of 31 BCE in our game of Antony and Cleopatra. The game at the moment is relatively quiet, not a huge amount of combat gone on so far, but what combat has gone on has been fairly significant. The opportunistic attack of Agrippa here at the very end of the last turn, during the November-December turn of 32 BCE, took advantage of the plague that was afflicting Cleopatra's squadrons and managed to take a couple of squadrons, one heavy and one light squadron, as a result of the advantage that the plague gave in terms of a negative column shift on the Cleopatra side. Also, I don't think I mentioned it at the end of the last turn because I was so caught up in what had happened just here, but there was some attrition going on towards the south, and Antony's stack of legions took a little bit of attrition and they lost an experienced legion. Now this is quite a significant issue because those legions cannot be rebuilt. They give a strength point bonus in combat. Basically they count double, and they cannot be rebuilt at all. The only way experienced legions can come back on the map is through the Western player's use of the off-map garrisons. So for the Eastern player, the blue player, you cannot rebuild those experienced legions at all in the entire game. And so for all of the advantage that the blue player may seem to have in terms of extra territory, extra resources, and to give you an indication, I've just left the resource gathering points at the top here. The blue player has 14 and the red player, the Western side, have just 10. But despite that advantage, despite the extra territory, seemingly more units at the beginning of the game, the real disadvantage that blue have is once they start losing those experienced legions, they cannot rebuild them. And that's a major problem. And also we're noticing here there's a little prestige point gap opened up as well. And while both players are currently on that pink section of the track, if I just move the camera over slightly, there we go, the pink section of the track is high prestige. Not too much of a problem, but once there is a gap opened up of 5 or more in terms of prestige points, and the lower player is on low prestige, which is the green track, which is more than half of the total track, you can start having defections happen. And that would be where whoever has got the highest number of prestige points would attempt to either remove units or stacks of units through defection, desertion essentially, or they will try and take entire provinces away. And that is the only way that provinces can change hands in the entire game. So a quiet turn now leading up to something far more active and eventful, shall we say, after the initial jockeying for position. And I will come back mid-turn, probably around summer or just about going into the summer turn, and give an update then, and then another one towards the end of the year. We didn't have to wait long at all for the game to take a turn for the eventful. The January-February turn of 31 BCE has seen Agrippa here just move from Ambracia around the coast of Achaea to chase Cleopatra and her squadrons out of the Greek mainland altogether over to Asia. Combat with the squadrons happened and took away one heavy squadron from Cleopatra. So that's not very good, really. Kind of uncool from Cleopatra's point of view. It caused a prestige point loss. The squadrons of the western side are coming in now to also kind of control the coast on the other side of Greece as well, and the transport ships have ferried across some of the legions to the Macedonia coastline as well, blocking the supply route through the via Essinatia which is this kind of dotted line that runs along here and is the only land-based hexes, or the land-locked hexes, that can be used to trace supply. Now what that means is this stack of units here are completely now out of supply, making any future attrition checks or defection checks much more difficult to pass for the blue player, unless of course the supply blockage can be removed. The blue player has done something very similar down here in the coast of Africa, using the squadrons to block the supply route for Octavian's forces there in basically what is roughly Libya, and that's because with the way supply works, you can trace supply to your supply port along the coastal route, so long as there are no squadrons in the hexes along that supply route. So essentially, as far as I understand anyway, land-based forces like Octavian's legions here cannot prevent supply coming to that group of squadrons, because they go along the coastline, which kind of makes sense if you think about it. The attrition has gone kind of the other way this turn though. We have plague in Rome. Perhaps some of those sailors on Agrippa's fleet brought back some plague from their travels, and also down here in Octavian's fleet as well. Now, outside of combat, that's not necessarily the worst thing to have happened to either side. It's a column shift should either of those forces get into combat, but given the distance from the nearest forces here and the relative strength of the forces down here, there's probably not going to be any combat. So at the end of the next turn's attrition phase, both those plague markers will come off with probably not a huge amount of detrimental effect. But we do now have this definite situation where the Western player is starting to push into the Eastern player's territory and taking some real gains from them in terms of territory on the map, if not in terms of the resource points at the moment. That might come later. So we'll move into spring, which starts in February and March. It's the end of the April and May turn 3 of the year 31 BCE, and again, same pattern as before, tons of action in this particular turn, really making up for any quietness of that first year. And what's happened really is the kind of war of attrition along the coastline between Agrippa and Cleopatra has continued. A little bit tit for tat, strength point loss here, strength point loss there, mostly affecting Cleopatra, because these forces here are now significantly outnumbering any squadrons that Cleopatra's with. The legions here in Macedonia have removed any resistance that was remaining from the Eastern player and have really negated any benefit of territory here that the Eastern player had, because there are no units there now. So even though the cubes here represent the cards, if that makes sense, the cubes represent these cards on the board and the resource points that you can get from there. Because there's red units, even though it's still controlled by blue, there are no friendly units there, so the resource points for those regions are not applicable anymore. So the red player is starting to eat into the resource advantage and the territory advantage that the blue player has through this war of attrition along here. The slow movement forward of Octavian has continued, and they've stopped outside Alexandria, which is just here in Egypt. And the reason they've stopped is because I think they learned a lesson of what happened up in Rome, up at the top here, where the Eastern player decided to try and take advantage of that plague and attack Rome. It was essentially a standoff, a siege, really, more than anything else. There are no siege rules in the game, but I like to think of it as it was a bit of a siege, and the roll was a question mark. And on the CRT, the question mark means both players roll separately. And because no player had to retreat or was eliminated, the attacking player could have a second run at combat. It's the only time that happens in the game. Not a hugely common occurrence, but it does happen, and happened here. The blue player attacked again, but this time was resoundingly beaten by the Romans in Rome, and the Eastern forces had to retreat. So that was a terrible blow, really, because what that has meant is the Eastern player has now moved down to low prestige, and the red player really has, if anything, gained prestige from winning that battle. And that means that now, as we move into what is going to be the June turn, the red player can now attempt defection against some of those forces and provinces even of the Eastern player, which is going to be potentially a problem, because now that we're on this slippery slope as the blue player, that's going to be quite hard to come back from given the current situation. But both sides do have some reinforcements coming in a couple of turns' time. Not sure if you can see there underneath the player aids, but there are some reinforcements on the track, some replacements that both sides have bought, so we're going to get some extra forces coming on. Again, as we move towards summer, it's going to get quite intense, I think, around the more populated areas on the map. Just finished the July turn of 31 BCE, and it's clear that this is going to be a decisive year in this civil war between Antony and Octavian. The reinforcements, or the replacements, have now available, have been handy in the sense that both sides have been able to have a wider choice of units. They were quite limited previously, and now we have extra legions on both sides that we can replace our lost units with. But what's really happened most of all is the introduction of defection, and this is a process by which when a player has a certain number of defection points more than the other player, and the other player is in the green or the low prestige part of the track, you can perform what's called a defection attempt, and you can either target a province, for example Macedonia or Achaia, or a group of units. And throughout the last couple of turns, so through June and July, the Western Roman Empire, the red player, has attempted to do just that. First, we attempted to take Macedonia to try and secure not only this important supply route here along the via Egnatia, but also to remove some of the resources from the eastern player through claiming that territory for ourselves. But the role was such that the eastern player was able to choose a province that would revolt and would defect, and the province that was chosen was Thrace, just here. So that Thrace is now part of the Western Roman Empire, but it does not produce any resources, so really that's not very helpful at all for the Western player. What was much more helpful the next turn was the target on this stack of units here, and that stack of units was the stack that had attacked Rome in the previous couple of turns, hadn't done so well at Rome and had been forced to retreat, having suffered some losses, and during the attrition phase of the Eastern player, that region developed plague, and then during the defection phase of the Western player, that stack of units did defect entirely, and so for the blue player, they lost 4 experienced legions out of the game entirely. That is huge for the Eastern player, because not only do they lose 1 prestige point for each unit that comes off the map, so that's 4 removed, they also cannot rebuild those legions. And with the challenges they're facing in terms of limited access to resources now through places like these regions here, Asia and Achaia, hit and miss whether or not they generate resources each turn, depending on whether or not we can get any boats in there or any soldiers, legions rather. Being able to replace any units is going to be really quite difficult now. Also means that there's a sizable gap. Just on this side of the map here, there's a sizable gap now of about probably 10 prestige points between the two sides. So a significant advantage now to the Western player. Not quite sure where to go from here. There was a little bit of attrition down here for the Western player, and a attack by Agrippa on this squadron fleet here really did fail. It didn't do very well at all. They were forced to retreat. They lost two squadrons themselves, and they lost a legion down here as well, but they were replaceable legions, replaceable squadrons. So moving on, as we move into autumn, it's going to be, wow, I don't really know where to begin with the Eastern player at the moment. They are surrounded by problems. They are being attacked on two fronts. Their best soldiers have defected in the midst of being ravaged by plague. Yeah, but for the Western player, now's the time to hit home and hit as hard as they possibly can to reduce the prestige track as much as possible the next few turns, and with the aim, of course, of getting that prestige down to 0. The September turn's just drawn to a close, and it's another very eventful turn, this time going much more in favour of the Eastern player than the Western player. So started off with the Western player sort of down to the south near Alexandria. Octavian tried to attack and take control of Alexandria, but was pushed back by Marc Antony. Immediately prior to that, a defection attempt on Achaea here had failed as well, and really not great. I mean, the best thing you can say really about the Western player's turn is that he didn't lose too many strength points. What happened though, which potentially is going to be very unfortunate for the next couple of turns, is the transport ships that the Western player has. Both sides have 3, and this is what you need to transport land units across the sea. They're both sort of sat here in Ephesus and Cleopatra, whose squadrons are here attacked. Failed miserably to do any damage to those unarmed and defenceless transports. So the squadrons there came in and did the job and completely annihilated those poor defenceless transports, meaning that there is no possibility now, at least not until they're rebuilt, of sending any reinforcements across the sea for Octavian down here, which could well be a bit of a problem because we have some land legions here, some legions who are currently out of supply because we have, well, they're not quite out of supply, but not at the moment, but they're at risk of being out of supply because they can't go this way because of the squadrons. It wouldn't take much for the squadrons here or Cleopatra to get past and place themselves sort of here, meaning there's no supply for that legion. And with winter coming up in a couple of turns, that could potentially lead to some quite nasty attrition. So the Western player is going to take advantage of one of those little rules in this game, where if you have a land unit over here in Syria, there's a particular hex. I think it's that hex there. I'll have to check the rules on that, and also one here in this island here, which doesn't have a name. I can't think of the name off the top of my head. But if you occupy those two spaces, you prevent any ships being built in the capital of Alexandria. So it's possible we could do that. Depending on what Cleopatra does, we could perhaps get a grip through over to here and the land units round, but we'll have to see how that goes. But anyway, another very, very eventful turn, moving into the October-November turn, and then on into winter. We've reached the end of the 31 BCE turn. Winter has now passed the halfway point as we move into the new year and 30 BCE. The year ended relatively quietly compared to the rest of the year that we played. A lot of the activity that went on beforehand seems to have somewhat drained the forces on both sides, and there was just a kind of a small scuffle here as the legions of the Western player moved down the coastline. But because Agrippa, who is currently sat underneath that plague counter just there, decided to retreat rather than press forward onto Cyprus. I remember the name of the island now. They really are a bit stuck there and on their own, these guys here. But attrition wasn't too bad. There was one unit lost, I think, in Alexandria. It really wasn't very much. There were a few plague counters dotted around, as you can see, but unless the Eastern player can get a long way across the board on this very next turn, which would be the first turn of 30 BCE, I can't really see them making much of that advantage they may have there. So as we move into the next year, there's a few important things to think about, and that's relating to the victory in the game. You can't really win this game unless you have definitely got your opponent down to 0 prestige. Both players are miles away from that at the moment. The Western player still has high prestige, and the Eastern player still has some 14 prestige points, so neither player are anywhere near that 0 mark. And the 0 would be for the outright victory. And if the game was to end, the person with the highest prestige would only win if they were currently occupying the capital of the opposing side. Any other result is a draw. So with that in mind, the Western player really does need to make a quick recovery and try and get Octavian's probably now quite tired forces, having spent the entire year fighting in the North African desert. Or the Eastern player, needs to sort of move out of Alexandria and try and take the fight a bit more to Octavian. We'll see how it goes. I'll start the next turn shortly and put my thoughts and the events in that video, which will be coming up shortly. Thanks very much for joining me once again. Hope you enjoyed the playthrough, and I'll see you next time.